Every camera drone in the chamber was pointed at me when I opened my fingers and let the head drop onto the polished table. It rolled once, leaving a dark smear across the white stone, and came to rest face up with all four of its pale yellow eyes still open. The horns scraped against the surface, with a sound like a fork dragged across a plate. I stood there with blood running down my wrist, my chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, and 900 star systems watching me live. My name is Dominic Hale, Sergeant, United Nations Marine Corps, 3rd Expeditionary Detail. 6 hours before that moment, I was the most boring man on a very boring assignment. We arrived aboard the Veilthari Dominion flagship, Throne of Silken Law, at 0800 station time. 4 Marines escorting Ambassador Lena Ortiz to a neutrality summit between the Veilthari Dominion and the Reshkai Pact. Earth was mediating, we were furniture. That was the job description. Stand behind the ambassador, look professional, keep your hands visible at all times, and above all else, do not remind anyone in the room what a Deathworlder is capable of when provoked. The flagship was grotesque in its luxury. Every corridor was lined with panels of crushed mineral that glittered under soft light, and the air had a faint sweetness to it that I later learned was a mild sedative compound. The Veilthari pumped through their ventilation systems. It was designed to keep visiting species calm and compliant. On a Veilthari nervous system, it worked beautifully. On a human nervous system, it did absolutely nothing. Our blood chemistry filtered it out the same way it filters out half the toxins in our own atmosphere. We breathed it in and felt nothing, and nobody on the Veilthari side seemed to know that. Corporal Ines Mazur walked beside me with her compact on her back and her eyes scanning every junction we passed. Behind us came Private Kwame Asante, broad-shouldered and quiet, carrying enough firepower on his hip to punch through a bulkhead if things went wrong. Private Sofia Ruiz brought up the rear with her medical kit, and the calm expression of someone who had stitched people together under gunfire more than once. Ambassador Ortiz walked ahead of us in her formal grays, her posture perfect, her expression warm and controlled. She was good at this. Years of deep space postings had taught her how to smile at beings who considered humanity somewhere between a curiosity and a pest, and she never let the insult reach her eyes. I carried my standard sidearm and a mono-edged combat blade on my left hip. The blade was 12 inches of layered carbon steel, with a molecular edge sharp enough to split individual cells. I had carried it through 3 years of the Fringe collapse, fighting rogue mining syndicates in dead systems where reinforcements were weeks away. I had used it on humans twice, and hoped I would never need to use it again. It was the kind of weapon you cleaned before you slept and sharpened before you ate. Because on the Fringe, the gap between a sharp blade and a dull one was the gap between waking up and not waking up. Before the Fringe, I had served 2 years on border patrol, along the contested shelf, the thin strip of unclaimed space between human territory and the nearest Veilthari expansion zone. That was where I first learned what the Veilthari thought of us. Their patrol ships would drift close to our markers, close enough to trigger proximity warnings, and then hold position for hours, testing, probing, seeing how long it would take us to flinch. We never flinched, and they never crossed, and eventually the patrol ships would withdraw. But the message was always the same. They considered the border a courtesy, not a boundary, and they wanted us to know it. The summit chamber was enormous. Cathedral ceilings carved from a single piece of dark stone, floating light fixtures that drifted like slow jellyfish, and a crescent-shaped table large enough to seat 40 delegates. Broadcast drones hovered near the ceiling, small silver spheres trailing thin blue sensor lines. This was a public event. Commander Zorvail Ket, the Veilthari military overlord hosting the summit, wanted the galaxy to watch him broker peace. Or more accurately, he wanted the galaxy to watch him dominate the room. I knew about Ket before we arrived. Everyone did. He was the supreme military authority of the Veilthari Dominion, a being who had personally overseen the conquest of 3 independent systems over the past decade. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, with skin the color of wet slate, and 4 curving horns that swept back from his skull like the tines of a crown. His species was predatory by origin, evolved on a high-gravity world with thick atmosphere and vicious competition. They were strong, fast, and culturally obsessed with hierarchy. Every interaction was a dominance display. Every word was a test. He entered the chamber with 50 personal guards in ceremonial armor and immediately changed the seating arrangement. The human delegation had been assigned seats at the main crescent table, equal in height and position to the Velthari and HFY delegations. Ket ordered his staff to bring in a smaller table, 6 inches lower, and place it at the far end of the room. He wanted us sitting below everyone else. A deliberate insult dressed up as a logistical adjustment. Ortiz handled it without a flicker. She sat at the lower table, arranged her documents, and smiled as if the view from there was exactly what she preferred. I stood behind her right shoulder and kept my face empty. The first hour of negotiations was a performance. Ket spoke at length about the Velthari military tradition, about the sacred duty of strength, about the natural order of species in the galactic hierarchy. He referenced humanity exactly 4 times. Each time it was a dismissal. He called us short-lived animals, promoted beyond our biology. He suggested that Earth's role as mediator was a courtesy extended to an amusing but ultimately irrelevant species. He looked directly at the broadcast drones when he said it, making sure every word was captured and transmitted. I watched the HFY delegates across the room. They were smaller beings, insectoid in structure with delicate limbs and faceted eyes that reflected the light. They said nothing during Ket's speech. Their silence had the quality of creatures who had been listening to this kind of talk for a very long time and had learned that objecting only made it worse. The second hour brought the real test. Ket proposed what he called a ceremonial affirmation of mutual respect. He produced a strip of dark fabric from a case carried by one of his attendants and explained that each delegation would accept the cloth as a symbol of good faith. The HFY delegates took it without objection. They draped it across their lead diplomat's shoulders and bowed in the shallow way their anatomy allowed. Then Ket turned to our table and held the cloth out toward Ambassador Ortiz. But the gesture was different. He held it low, near the ground, and the way his guards shifted told me everything. This was not a mutual exchange. This was a submission ritual. Accepting the cloth from that position meant kneeling. It meant lowering yourself beneath the person offering it and acknowledging their authority over you. Ortiz understood it immediately. She stood, maintained her smile, and declined with the precise diplomatic language the situation required. She thanked Ket for the gesture, acknowledged the tradition, and explained that Earth's protocols did not permit physical submission rituals between sovereign entities during active negotiations. Ket stared at her for 3 seconds. Then he did something I was not prepared for. He walked away from her. He came down from his elevated platform, crossed the open floor of the chamber, and stopped directly in front of me. Not the ambassador, not the diplomat, the soldier, the armed one. He looked down at me from his full height, his 4 eyes narrowing, and I could feel the attention of every drone in the room locking onto us. He raised his hand, 4 thick fingers, each one ridged with calloused bone, spread wide and pulled back behind his shoulder. I saw it coming. Every instinct I had screamed at me to move, to dodge, to catch the wrist and break it. But I was trained. I was disciplined. I was under orders to remain still and not escalate. His hand came forward and struck the left side of my face with enough force to split the skin along my cheekbone. The sound was sharp and flat, like a plank of wood slapping water. My head turned with the impact, and I felt blood begin to run down my jaw in a warm, thin line. The chamber went silent. Every delegate, every guard, every floating drone held perfectly still. Ket leaned in close enough that I could smell the metallic tang of his breath, and he said it loudly, clearly, for every microphone in the room to capture. Even your warriors accept correction. 5 seconds. That was all it took. The first second, I tasted copper on my tongue and felt the sting radiate across my cheekbone like a burn. The second, my eyes moved without my head turning. I counted every guard in my peripheral vision, 12 on my left, 8 on my right, the rest behind Ket. 2 exits, both 20 meters away, 9 drones overhead. The third second, I shifted my weight from my heels to the balls of my feet. My center of gravity dropped 2 inches. My shoulders loosened. The fourth second, my left hand found the grip of the monoblade. My fingers closed around the handle, and I felt the familiar weight settle into my palm like a handshake from an old friend. The fifth second, I moved. I do not say that to sound dramatic. I say it because it is the only accurate way to describe what happened. I did not lunge. I did not swing. I moved. The blade cleared the sheath in a quarter of a second. My arm extended in a rising arc that began at my hip and ended 6 inches above Ket's shoulders. The mono edge passed through the tissue and bone of his neck with so little resistance that for one impossible instant, nothing happened at all. Then gravity remembered its job. The body stayed standing for almost a full second, which is something they never tell you about. The nervous system keeps firing, the muscles keep holding, and the balance stays locked even after the connection is severed. Then the blood pressure dropped, and the legs folded, and 8 feet of Veilthari military commander collapsed onto a floor made of crushed gemstones, with a sound like a bag of wet sand thrown from a height. The head landed 3 feet away, and I picked it up by the base of the left horn before it stopped rolling. Every camera drone in the chamber was pointed at me. Every broadcast feed that Commander Zorvail Ket had set up to show the galaxy a Deathworlder being humiliated was now showing something very different. I stood in the center of that gilded room, blood on my hand, blood on my face, and the severed head of the most powerful military commander in the Veilthari Dominion hanging from my grip. 900 star systems watched me breathe. I did not say a word. I did not need to. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. I counted them the way I count everything in combat, by the beat of my own pulse. 4 heartbeats of absolute stillness, in a room full of armed aliens who had just watched their supreme commander separated from his body by a creature half his size. Then the room broke open. The first guard to react was standing 6 feet to my left. He was tall, young by Veilthari standards, and his hand went to his sidearm with the jerky motion of someone whose training had never been tested by real shock. I turned my head toward him, just my head, nothing else, and he stopped. His fingers froze on the weapon's grip. His 4 eyes locked onto mine, and I watched the calculation happen behind them. He was measuring the distance between us, the speed of what he had just witnessed, and the probability that he could draw, aim, and fire before I closed the gap. He decided he could not. His hand came off the weapon and dropped to his side. That single moment bought me 2 more seconds, and in those 2 seconds, the rest of my team moved. Corporal Mazur grabbed Ambassador Ortiz by the arm and pulled her behind the overturned lower table. Private Asante stepped forward to my right, his sidearm already drawn and held low against his thigh, his eyes sweeping the room in controlled arcs. Private Ruiz positioned herself between Ortiz and the nearest exit, her medical kit discarded, her own weapon in hand. We had not spoken a single word to each other. We did not need to. 3 years of training and field deployment had given us a shared language that existed below words. Geometry, positioning, fields of fire. We moved like fingers on the same hand because that is what Marines do when the room goes wrong. I set Ket's head down on the summit table. Not gently. I placed it upright, facing the largest cluster of broadcast drones, and let go. The 4 yellow eyes stared out at the cameras with an expression that had frozen somewhere between disbelief and the beginning of fear. I wanted the galaxy to see that expression. I wanted every species watching to understand that the last thing Commander Zorvail Ket ever felt was the realization that he had made a terrible mistake. 50 Veilthari guards stood in a loose semicircle around the chamber. Every one of them was armed, every one of them was trained, and every one of them was standing perfectly still, because the thing they were trained to deal with had just been rendered meaningless. I understood their hesitation, because I understood their biology. The Veilthari combat response was well documented in our briefing files. Their species had evolved a threat processing sequence that required approximately 1.8 seconds to transition from a resting state to full combat readiness. It was a neurological limitation built into their predatory wiring. Their brains needed to assess the threat, categorize it, select a response, and activate the appropriate muscle groups in sequence. 1.8 seconds. Fast by galactic standards. Most species took 3 seconds or more. I had gone from parade rest to lethal action in under 1 second. Not because I was special. Not because I was enhanced or modified or running on combat stimulants, because I was human. Because on our world, 1.8 seconds is enough time to be bitten, stung, trampled, or dragged into deep water by something that wants to eat you. Evolution did not give us the luxury of a slow activation sequence. On Earth, the gap between recognizing a threat and responding to it is measured in fractions of a heartbeat, and the creatures that needed more than that did not survive long enough to pass on their genes. The guards knew this now, not intellectually, not as a line in a briefing document, but in the deep, visceral way that a prey animal knows it is standing too close to something that moves faster than it can think. Sergeant Hale, Ambassador Ortiz's voice came from behind the overturned table, sharp and controlled. Status. Threat neutralized, I said without turning around. Room is not secure. The broadcast feeds, Mazur said from her position near Ortiz. I could hear her fingers working the comm-pack. They are still live. Every single one. This is going out on open channels across the entire Summit network. I looked up at the drones. Their blue sensor lines were pulsing steadily, recording everything, transmitting everything. Ket had set them up himself. He had wanted the galaxy to watch him put a Deathworlder in its place. He had arranged the cameras, chosen the angles, and made sure the signal would reach every major network in every system that recognized Veilthari Broadcast Authority. 900 systems, trillions of viewers, all of them watching. The irony was perfect, and I felt it settle into my chest like a cold stone. I did not smile. Smiling would have been wrong. But I let the drones see my face, blood drying on my cheek, eyes steady, posture unchanged, and I knew that the image being broadcast was worth more than any speech, any treaty, or any show of force Earth had ever deployed. This was the message. You hit us, and this is what happens. Not in a week, not after a committee meeting. In 5 seconds. I could hear the murmuring now from outside the chamber. Voices in the corridor, rapid and overlapping. The sound of organized panic spreading through a command structure that had just lost its head in the most literal way possible. Guard boots on gemstone floors. Moving fast. Moving in patterns that spoke of confusion more than coordination. They were regrouping, but they were doing it without the man who had told them what to do for 20 years, and the gap he left was wider than the one on his neck. A door opened at the far end of the chamber. The guards near it shifted aside, and a new figure entered. He was smaller than Ket, leaner, with horns that curved downward rather than back. His uniform was different too, silver where Ket's had been gold, and he moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that every step he took in this room was being recorded for history. Subcommander Drael Voss, second in the Veilthari military hierarchy. I had read his file during the transit to the flagship. Career officer, politically cautious, known for preferring negotiation over force. Under any other circumstances, he would have been a reasonable person to deal with. But these were not other circumstances. His commanding officer's body was cooling on the floor between us, and the body's head was sitting on the table like a centerpiece. Voss stopped 10 paces from me and looked at the scene. His 4 eyes moved slowly from the body to the head, to the blood on the gemstone floor, to the blade still in my hand. I watched his throat move as he swallowed. "Sergeant," he said, in carefully pronounced English, "you will surrender your weapons and submit to detention." "No," I said. The word landed in the room like a second blade. Voss's expression shifted. Not anger, not yet. Confusion. In the Veilthari command structure, a direct refusal of an order from a superior officer was so rare that their language barely had grammar for it. "You are on a Veilthari vessel," Voss said. "You are subject to Veilthari military jurisdiction. You have killed a commanding officer of the Dominion. You will surrender." "Your commanding officer struck a uniformed member of the United Nations Armed Forces during a declared diplomatic summit," I said. I did not need to. The drones were close enough to pick up a whisper. Under Section 9 of the Galactic Diplomatic Accord, physical assault on sovereign military personnel inside a neutral summit zone constitutes a breach of protected status and authorizes defensive response. I responded, "Your jurisdiction does not apply to an act of self-defense taken during an active treaty violation." I had memorized that passage during basic training. Every Marine did. We memorized it the same way we memorized our blood type and our next-of-kin contact information, because the brass knew that sooner or later, somewhere in the galaxy, someone was going to test a Deathworlder, and when that happened, the legal framework needed to be ready before the blood dried. Voss looked at me for a long time. Behind him, his guards shifted uneasily. They were waiting for an order. They wanted to be told to act, to avenge their commander, to restore the hierarchy that had just been dismantled in front of a galactic audience. But Voss was smarter than that. He was looking at 4 humans in a room full of 50 Valthari soldiers, and he was doing the math that Ket should have done before raising his hand. 4 humans. One had just killed the most feared warrior in the Dominion in less time than it takes to blink. The other 3 were positioned in a tactical formation that covered every angle of the room. They were calm. Their hands were steady. Their breathing was controlled. They looked like they had done this before, because they had. Mazur's voice broke the silence from behind me. "Sergeant. Earth Command on Priority Channel. Emergency Directive incoming." "Read it," I said. "Hold position. Reinforcements en route. Do not surrender personnel or arms." I looked at Voss and let that settle between us. "You heard the order," I said. "I am not going anywhere." Voss's jaw tightened. I could see the muscles working beneath the slate-colored skin, the effort of restraint, the political calculation running behind his eyes. He wanted to give the order. Every fiber of his Valthari hierarchy conditioning was screaming at him to respond to this challenge with force. But the cameras were still rolling, and the galaxy was still watching. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the image of Ket's body folding to the floor was playing on a loop. "You have 1 hour," Voss said. "At the end of that hour, I will breach this chamber and take you by force." I held his gaze without blinking. Behind me, I could feel my team settle into the kind of stillness that comes before action, the particular quiet that humans produce when they have accepted the situation and are simply waiting for it to begin. "Then you have 1 hour to decide how many of your people you are willing to lose," I said. "Because I promise you, Sub-Commander, the number will not be 0. And the cameras are still running. The galaxy will see every second of what happens if you send your people through that door. They will see your guards enter, and they will see how many of them do not walk back out. That is not a threat, that is a forecast." Voss turned and walked out of the chamber. The guards followed him, all 50 of them filing through the door in rigid formation, their eyes forward, their weapons holstered. Not one of them looked at me as they passed. Not one of them looked at the body on the floor. They walked past the remains of their supreme commander, the way you walk past a piece of furniture you have decided is no longer in the room. When the door sealed behind the last guard, the room was finally ours. Ortiz stood up from behind the table. Her face was pale. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "Do you understand what you have done?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Every government in the galaxy is going to respond to this. Every alliance, every trade agreement, every military pact involving Earth is going to be reevaluated in the next 24 hours, because of what you just did in this room." "He hit me," I said. Ortiz opened her mouth, closed it, and then looked at the broadcast drones still circling overhead. "He hit you," she repeated quietly. "On camera, in a diplomatic zone, unprovoked." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then something changed in her expression. The diplomat's mask shifted, and underneath it I saw something harder. Something that did not belong in treaty rooms and summit chambers. Something human. "Mazur," she said, "make sure those feeds stay live. I want every second of this on record." "Already on it, Ambassador." Ortiz looked at me one more time. Then she looked at the head on the table, at the blood on the floor, at the 4 Marines standing ready in a room built for ceremony and now consecrated by something far more ancient. "Well," she said, "I suppose we should prepare for company." I sheathed the blade, wiped my hand on my trouser leg, and began walking the perimeter of the room. We had 1 hour, 50 guards on the other side of that door, a dead commander on the floor, a live broadcast reaching 900 star systems, and 4 Marines with enough training, enough ammunition, and enough sheer biological stubbornness to make this the most expensive room the Velthari Dominion had ever tried to enter. I checked my weapon. I counted the exits. I measured the distance from the barricade to the door, and calculated firing angles. And somewhere in the back of my mind, behind the training, and the adrenaline, and the cold, clear focus that my species perfected over 1,000,000 years of fighting everything our planet threw at us, I felt something I had not expected. Calm. Not the calm of indifference, the calm of certainty. I had drawn a line, and I would hold it. Whatever came through that door in 1 hour would find out what every predator on Earth learned eventually, that the most dangerous creature is not the one that attacks first, but the one that has decided it will not move. Asante finished barricading the main entrance with the heavy crescent table, while I mapped the structural weak points of the chamber walls. The Velthari built for beauty, not defense. The stone was dense but brittle at the joints, and the decorative panels along the lower sections were hollow behind their gemstone facades. A single breach charge in the right place would open a hole large enough for 3 soldiers to push through at once. I counted 4 such weak points and positioned our remaining furniture accordingly. Ruiz distributed the emergency rations from her medical kit. 4 protein bars and 2 water pouches split between 5 people. It was not enough for a long siege, but we were not planning on a long siege. Either help would arrive or it would not, and if it did not, no amount of protein bars would change the outcome. I checked our ammunition. Asante carried 60 rounds for his sidearm and 2 concussion grenades that were technically not authorized for diplomatic escort duty, but that nobody had inspected when we boarded. Mazur had her standard sidearm with 40 rounds. Ruiz carried 30. I had my sidearm with 50 rounds and the blade. Against 50 Velthari guards in powered armor, the math was not favorable. But math does not account for choke points, and the doorway was a beautiful choke point. Mazur set up her comm equipment on the floor behind the thickest section of overturned table and began scanning every frequency she could reach. Within minutes, the scope of what was happening outside this room became clear. "Sergeant," she said, looking up from her display with an expression I had never seen on her face. "The footage has gone viral. Viral does not even begin to cover it. Every major galactic broadcast network is running the clip. The Velthari Summit feed had direct relay agreements with over 200 regional networks, and those networks have sub-relays, and those sub-relays feed into local systems. The 6-second clip of the decapitation has become the single most viewed piece of media in recorded galactic history." "How long has it been?" I asked. 43 minutes since the event. Current estimated viewership across all platforms is approaching 900 billion and climbing. 900 billion. I let that number sit in my mind for a moment, trying to give it weight, trying to understand what it meant for that many eyes to have watched what my hands did in this room. I could not. The number was too large. It belonged to a category of reality that did not fit inside a single human skull. Ruiz had moved Ambassador Ortiz to the far corner of the chamber, the spot with the most stone between it and the door. She was checking the ambassador for injuries, running a scanner along her arms and neck, making sure the shock of the last hour had not triggered anything the human body sometimes does when the mind absorbs more than it can process at once. "She is physically fine," Ruiz reported. "Elevated heart rate, mild tremor in the hands, cortisol spike consistent with acute stress response. Nothing dangerous." "I am right here," Ortiz said from the corner. "And I am fine. Stop scanning me and start monitoring the enemy communications." Mazur switched frequencies and began intercepting Velthari military traffic. The encryption was decent by galactic standards, but Earth had been breaking Velthari codes since first contact. Within 5 minutes, she had a clear picture of the command structure on the other side of the door. "Voss has established a perimeter around the summit wing," she reported. 300 guards in staged positions along the corridor. Heavy weapons teams at the 2 main junctions. He has also sealed the docking bays. Nothing is leaving this ship without his authorization. "What about the fleet?" I asked. 14 Veilthari warships holding position around the flagship. No movement. No weapons activation. They are waiting for orders from Voss, but Voss is waiting for guidance from the Grand Senate, and the Grand Senate is in emergency session. How long has the Senate been in session? 21 minutes. Based on the traffic I am intercepting, it is not going well for them. Mazur pulled up a summary of the intercepted transmissions and read the key points aloud. The Veilthari Grand Senate was in chaos. Ket had been more than a military commander. He was a political institution, a symbol of Veilthari dominance that the entire power structure had been built around for 20 years. His death had created a vacuum that every faction in their government was now rushing to fill, and none of them could agree on how to respond to the human who had created it. One faction wanted war, full military response, destroy the human delegation, transmit a warning to Earth, and demonstrate that the Dominion would not tolerate the killing of its leadership. But this faction was smaller than I expected, because the more experienced senators had already done the math. Earth's fleet was smaller than the Veilthari Armada, but it was crewed entirely by Deathworlders. Every ship, every weapon, every tactical decision was made by beings who came from a planet where the survival instinct had been sharpened to a razor edge over 4 billion years. A war with Earth would not be the quick disciplinary action some senators imagined. It would be a grinding, bleeding, generational conflict against an enemy that did not know how to quit. A second faction wanted negotiation, declare Ket's actions a violation of diplomatic law, distance the Dominion from his behavior, and use the incident to restructure the military hierarchy in ways that benefited their own political positions. This faction was growing by the minute, because politicians are the same everywhere in the galaxy. They see opportunity in disaster the way predators see opportunity in wounded prey. A third faction, the smallest, said nothing at all. These were the senators who represented the conquered systems, the worlds Ket had taken by force over the past decade. They sat in silence and listened to their colleagues argue, and I suspected that behind their carefully neutral expressions, they were feeling something very close to satisfaction. There is another layer to this, Mazur said. Non-Veilthari reactions are coming in on open channels. I am picking up diplomatic traffic from at least 30 species. She read the highlights. The HFY Pact, the insectoid species that had been sitting across the table during the summit, had issued a formal statement within 20 minutes of the incident. It was short and devastatingly precise. They condemned the assault on the human delegation, invoked Article 7 of the Galactic Diplomatic Accord, and formally requested that all Veilthari military vessels withdraw from the neutral zone within 6 hours. The statement made no mention of Ket's death. It treated the decapitation as a non-event, as if a diplomat being struck in a summit chamber was the only crime worth addressing, and whatever happened afterward was simply the natural consequence. 11 other species issued similar statements within the hour. Some were allies of the HFY, some were independent systems with no stake in the summit. All of them focused on the slap, not the blade. The message was coordinated and clear. The galaxy was choosing to frame this incident as an assault by a Veilthari commander, not a killing by a human sergeant. And they were doing so because every one of those species had spent years living under Ket's shadow, and they were glad he was gone. Earth Command has released a public statement, Mazur said. She read it aloud, and I felt something tighten in my chest as I listened. Sergeant Hale responded to an act of physical aggression against a uniformed member of the United Nations Armed Forces within a declared diplomatic zone. Earth does not instruct its soldiers to accept assault. The legal framework governing the sergeant's response is established under Section 9 of the Galactic Diplomatic Accord, to which the Veilthari Dominion is a signatory. Earth stands behind its personnel. Short, cold, final. No apology. No qualification, no diplomatic softening. Earth had drawn the same line I had drawn, and they had drawn it in front of 900 star systems. Ortiz listened to the statement from her corner and nodded once. Good, she said. That is exactly the right tone. I turned away from the group and walked to the far wall of the chamber, where a tall viewport looked out into open space. The Veilthari fleet hung in formation against the starfield, 14 warships arranged in the layered defensive pattern their doctrine preferred. They were beautiful in the way that instruments of violence are sometimes beautiful. all clean lines and polished hulls and weapons arrays folded against their sides like the wings of sleeping birds. Beyond them, nothing. Empty space in every direction. No help visible, no reinforcement on the sensors, just the cold dark and the distant light of unfamiliar stars. But Mazur had said reinforcements were en route, and Earth Command did not make promises it could not keep. Somewhere out there, cutting through the void at speeds that would compress the light of passing stars into blue streaks, a ship was coming. I did not know which ship. I did not know how many Marines were aboard. I only knew that they were coming, and that the people who sent them understood what was at stake. I stood at the viewport and examined my own reflection in the glass. The cut on my cheek had stopped bleeding, but the blood had dried in a dark line from my cheekbone to my jaw. My uniform was stained at the collar and the left sleeve. My eyes looked the same as they always did. Steady and slightly tired, the eyes of a man who had spent too many years in places where rest was a luxury and alertness was survival. Behind me, I heard Mazur intercept a transmission that made her breath catch. "Sergeant, priority signal. Un-MC vessel incoming. It is the Achilles Wake. Captain Yuki Tanaka commanding. She is broadcasting on open channels." The words filled the chamber from Mazur's speakers, transmitted on every frequency the Veilthari fleet could receive, clear and unhurried. "This is Captain Yuki Tanaka, of the Un-MC Achilles Wake. We are here to collect our people. Any delay will be interpreted as hostility." I turned from the viewport and looked at my team. Mazur had a grin she was trying to suppress. Asante checked his weapon with renewed focus. Ruiz was already repacking her medical kit. Ortiz stood up straight, smoothed her jacket, and became the ambassador again. Outside the viewport, I saw it. A point of light that had not been there before, growing brighter against the dark, moving with the kind of deliberate velocity that only a warship built by Deathworlders could sustain. The Achilles Wake dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Veilthari formation, and even through the viewport, even at that distance, I could see the 14 alien warships shift in their positions the way animals shift when something larger enters the clearing. Voss had given us 1 hour. 46 minutes had passed. The clock was still running, but the math had changed. I almost smiled. The Achilles Wake held position at the edge of the Veilthari formation, like a wolf sitting down at the border of someone else's territory. She was not the largest ship in the field. 3 of the Veilthari warships outmassed her by significant margins. But mass is not the only thing that matters in a confrontation, and every officer in that fleet knew it. I watched through the viewport as the alien formation adjusted itself. The 14 warships tightened their pattern, closing ranks around the flagship in a protective shell. It was a defensive posture, not an aggressive one, and that single detail told me everything I needed to know about how Sub-Commander Voss was reading the situation. He was not preparing to attack, he was preparing to be attacked, and the distinction meant that somewhere in his chain of command, someone had already decided that the smart move was to let us leave. Mazur intercepted the comm traffic between Voss and the Veilthari Grand Senate. The argument had shifted. The war faction had lost ground. The arrival of a human warship, alone, without escorts, broadcasting its intentions on open channels, where the entire galaxy could hear, had changed the political equation. If the Veilthari fired on a ship that had announced a peaceful extraction mission in front of 900 star systems of witnesses, they would be confirming every accusation of barbarism that Ket Slap had already planted. The optics were ruinous, and the Veilthari were a species that understood optics. 19 minutes before Voss's deadline expired, the door to the summit chamber opened again. Voss entered alone. No guards, no escort, no weapons visible. He walked to the center of the room, stopped 5 paces from me, and stood with his hands at his sides in a posture that I recognized from our briefing materials as a Veilthari submission display. Not full submission, not the kind that Ket had tried to force on Ortiz, but the intermediate form that acknowledged equal standing between 2 parties in conflict. "The Grand Senate has reached a preliminary decision," he said. "Commander Ket's actions in this chamber are under review for violations of the Galactic Diplomatic Accord. Pending the completion of that review, the Veilthari Dominion will not obstruct the departure of the human delegation." Ortiz stepped forward. She had smoothed her hair, straightened her jacket, and assembled her diplomatic armor in the 20 minutes since Tanaka's broadcast. She looked like a woman who had never been crouched behind an overturned table. "Subcommander Voss," she said, "Earth accepts the Dominion's decision. We will depart immediately. All communication regarding the review may be directed to the Earth Diplomatic Corps through standard channels." Voss nodded. His eyes moved to me, and I saw something in them that was not anger and was not fear. It was a kind of exhausted recognition, the look of a man who had spent his entire career in the shadow of a superior he could not challenge, and was now standing in the wreckage of that superior's mistakes. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "for what it is worth, he should not have struck you." I said nothing. There was nothing to say that the cameras had not already said for me. The extraction was a masterpiece of controlled theater. Captain Tanaka deployed a Marine strike team from the Achilles Wake, 16 men and women in full battle armor, visors down, weapons cold but visible on their hips and backs. They did not run, they did not shout. They walked through the corridors of the throne of silken law in perfect formation, their boots striking the gemstone floors in synchronized rhythm, and every Veilthari soldier they passed stepped aside without being told. I had seen Marine strike teams deploy in combat zones, in collapsed mining stations, in orbital facilities where the atmosphere was venting and the gravity generators were failing. I had never seen one deploy in a pristine corridor on a pristine ship, where no shot had been fired, and no order to engage had been given. The effect was different. In a combat zone, Marines are a weapon. In that corridor, they were a statement. Every step said the same thing. "We are here. We are not asking permission. Move." The lead Marine was a staff sergeant named Grace Holloway, 6 feet tall with shoulders built for carrying the kind of weight that breaks smaller frames. She met us at the chamber door, assessed the room in 2 seconds, and gave me a nod that contained more professional respect than most people manage in an entire conversation. "Sergeant Hale," she said, "good to see you standing." "Good to be standing," I said. "Command wants you on the ship in 10 minutes. Ambassador first, then your team, then us. Standard withdrawal formation. No engagement unless they force it." "They will not force it," I said. Holloway looked at the body on the floor and the head on the table. "No," she agreed. "I do not expect they will." I walked at the center of the formation with Ortiz, Mazur, Asante, and Ruiz. My blade was on my hip, unsheathed, and nobody asked me to put it away. The blood on my uniform had dried to a dark brown, and I made no effort to clean it. Let them see it. Let every alien on this ship see what their commander's arrogance had cost him, and let them carry that image with them into every future negotiation with a Deathworlder. We passed through the main corridor of the flagship, and I noticed something that stopped me for half a step. Veilthari crew members had gathered along the walls, hundreds of them, standing in silence and watching us pass. They were not armed. They were not hostile. They were watching with the focused attention of people who were seeing something historic and knew it. People who understood that the galaxy they lived in yesterday was not the same galaxy they would live in tomorrow, and that the change had started in a room they walked past every day. One of them, a young Veilthari female in a technician's uniform, caught my eye as I passed. She did not look away. She held my gaze for 3 full seconds, and then she did something that I would think about for years afterward. She placed her right hand flat against her chest, fingers spread, in a gesture I later learned was the Veilthari sign of acknowledged debt. A silent admission that something owed had been paid. I did not know what debt she felt had been settled. I would learn later, when the full scope of Ket's crimes became public knowledge, that his brutality had not been limited to conquered species. His own people had suffered under his command, in ways that the Veilthari military structure was designed to hide, and the Senate was motivated to ignore. The technician in the corridor may have owed her gesture to any one of 100 grievances. I did not ask. It was not my debt to understand. The Achilles Wake brought us aboard through the main hangar bay, and the moment the airlock sealed behind us, I felt a shift in the air pressure that told me we were on a human ship again. The gravity was Earth standard. The temperature was 21 degrees. The air smelled like recycled oxygen and gun oil and coffee. The universal scent of a military vessel crewed by people who considered caffeine a strategic resource. Captain Yuki Tanaka met us in the briefing room. She was shorter than I expected, compact and precise in her movements, with dark eyes that assessed everything they landed on, and a voice that carried the quiet authority of someone who did not need to raise it. She shook Ortiz's hand first, then turned to me. "Sergeant Hale," she said, "I have watched the footage 17 times. Legal has reviewed it. Command has reviewed it. The Galactic Diplomatic Corps has reviewed it. And," I said, "and you are not under arrest. Your actions fall within the defensive response framework established under Section 9. KET initiated physical contact in a protected zone. You responded with proportional force." "Proportional," I repeated. "By Deathworld standards, a strike to the face from an armed aggressor twice your size is a lethal threat. Your response was consistent with neutralizing a lethal threat. The legal framework holds." She said it with the flat certainty of someone who had argued the point 6 times in the last hour and won every argument. I nodded and said nothing else. The debriefing lasted 2 hours. I gave my account 3 times, each time to a different officer, each time recorded and transmitted to Earth Command in real time. The facts did not change because the facts were simple. "He hit me," I responded. That was the entirety of the event, stripped of politics and consequence, and the 900 billion pairs of eyes that had watched it happen. Afterward, Tanaka told me what was happening in the wider galaxy. The footage had done something that no military action, no diplomatic initiative, and no trade agreement had ever accomplished. It had forced every species in the galactic community to confront a question they had been avoiding since humanity's first contact. What happens when you push a Deathworlder past the point of restraint? The answer was now playing on every screen in civilized space. 6 seconds of footage that showed the transition from stillness to absolute violence in less time than it took most species to register a threat. Military analysts across the galaxy were dissecting the clip frame by frame, measuring my reaction time, calculating the force of the blade strike, documenting the biomechanical impossibility of a creature my size generating that much speed from a standing start. Their conclusions were unanimous and terrifying. Humans were not merely strong or fast or aggressive. They were complete. They combined reflexes, strength, tactical awareness, and the willingness to commit lethal force into a single package that had no equivalent in the known galaxy. Other species had individual advantages. Some were stronger, some were faster, some were more durable. But no other species combined all of those traits with the psychological capacity to switch from calm conversation to absolute combat in a fraction of a second. The Veilthari had a word for it, that Tanaka translated roughly as the gap. It referred to the moment between provocation and response, the tiny window in which most species processed, hesitated, calculated, and reconsidered. Every species in the galaxy had a gap. Humans did not. The gap had been killed on the savannas of Africa 1,000,000 years ago, eaten by lions and crushed by stampedes, and drowned in flash floods, until the only humans left were the ones who could hear a twig snap and be moving before the sound reached their conscious mind. Ithdekan had not understood the gap. He had stood in front of a Deathworlder and assumed that the rules of his world applied, that a display of dominance would be met with submission, that the hierarchy he had built on the broken backs of weaker species would hold against a creature forged by a planet that killed 99% of everything it produced. He was wrong. The galaxy watched him be wrong, and now the galaxy was recalculating. Tanaka dismissed me to my quarters. I walked the corridors of the Achilles Wake alone, past the mess hall where off-duty Marines were eating in unusual silence, and found my cabin. It was small, standard issue, with a bunk and a locker and a narrow shelf above the sink. I sat on the edge of the bunk and looked at my hands. The knuckles on my left hand were bruised where they had gripped the blade at the moment of impact. There was still blood under my fingernails. I washed it off in the sink, watching the water turn pink and then clear. I dried my hands and touched the cut on my cheek. It had scabbed over, rough and raised, and I knew it would scar. A permanent ridge on the left side of my face, where a tyrant's hand had landed, and a tyrant's world had ended. I thought about the mess hall, about the Marines eating in silence. I knew what that silence meant. They had all seen the footage. Every man and woman on this ship had watched me kill a being on live broadcast, and they were processing it the way soldiers process these things, quietly, privately, with the understanding that words are insufficient and that the only honest response is to sit with the weight of it and let it settle where it will. Some of them would see me differently now. Some would see me as the man who stood up for humanity. Others would see me as the man who started a galactic incident with a knife and 5 seconds of uncontrolled reflex. Both views would be correct, and neither would be complete. And I would walk past those divided opinions in the mess hall and the corridors and the briefing rooms for the rest of my career. I opened a delayed comm channel and placed a call to my sister. Her name was Claire, and she lived in a small town on the coast of England, where the wind came off the sea hard enough to bend the trees sideways. The connection took 11 minutes to establish across the relay network, and when her face appeared on the screen, I could see that she had been crying. "I saw it," she said. "Everyone saw it, Dom. The whole planet." "I know. Mom has not stopped calling me. She does not know whether to be proud or terrified. Tell her both is fine." Claire looked at me through the screen with the particular intensity of a younger sibling who had spent her entire life watching her older brother walk into dangerous places and walk back out again. She had the same eyes as our mother, green and sharp, and they were red at the edges now. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes." "Are you really?" I thought about the question. I thought about the head on the table, and the body on the floor, and the sound the blade made, passing through alien bone. I thought about the silence afterward, and the cameras, and the 900 billion people who had watched me take a life in high definition. I thought about the young Veilthari technician who had pressed her hand to her chest in the corridor. "I am exactly what they trained me to be," I said. "Whether that means I am all right depends on who you ask." Claire wiped her eyes and managed a smile that did not quite reach them. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, about the weather at home, and the cat that had started sleeping on her car, and the neighbor who was building an extension that blocked the afternoon light. Normal things, human things, the small, warm details of a life lived on a planet where not everything was trying to kill you, even though most things historically had been. When the call ended, I lay on the bunk and stared at the ceiling. The ship hummed around me, engines and life support, and the quiet pulse of a vessel at alert status, and I closed my eyes and let the sound fill the space where thought wanted to intrude. I did not dream, I rarely do, but in the darkness behind my eyelids, I saw the moment again. Not the blade, not the blood, the 5 seconds. The gap between the slap and the response, the tiny eternity in which a decision was made that could not be unmade, and a line was drawn that could not be undrawn. When I opened my eyes, 8 hours had passed, and a new transmission was waiting on my terminal. The Veilthari Grand Senate had officially declared Ket's actions a violation of diplomatic law. They had posthumously stripped his rank and titles. They had released a statement condemning his assault on the human delegation and acknowledging that the defensive response of the UNMIC personnel was legally justified under the terms they themselves had signed. And they had requested a reconciliation summit with Earth to repair diplomatic relations. Below the official transmission, encrypted on a channel that should not have been able to reach a UMC vessel, was a second message. It had no sender identification, no return address, no signature. It contained a single line of text, translated into English from a Veilthari dialect that my ship's computer flagged as archaic. "There are others who would have stopped him sooner. We failed. You did not. We remember." I read it twice. Then I closed the terminal and went to find Captain Tanaka, because the galaxy was still turning, and there was more work to do. 3 weeks after the incident aboard the throne of Silken Law, I stood in the main corridor of Neutral Station, Meridian Cross, and adjusted the collar of my dress uniform. The scar on my cheek had healed into a permanent ridge that caught the light when I turned my head, a thin white line against sun-browned skin that I had stopped noticing in the mirror, but that nobody else could stop staring at. The Veilthari Dominion had specifically requested that I serve as security lead for the Reconciliation Summit, not a different Marine, not a senior officer, me, the man who had taken their commander's head. Ambassador Ortiz had raised an eyebrow when the request came through, but she had not objected. She understood the logic, even if she found it uncomfortable. It was not forgiveness. The Veilthari did not operate on forgiveness. Their culture ran on a different currency, one measured in demonstrations of capability and the respect that followed. By requesting my presence, they were telling the galaxy that they recognized what I was, and were willing to sit across a table from it. It was the oldest transaction in civilized space, dressed up in diplomatic language, but built on the same foundation that every species understood. You do not fear what you can control. You respect what you cannot. Meridian Cross was a different kind of station than the Veilthari flagship. It was built by a consortium of 12 species as a permanent neutral zone, designed for exactly the kind of high-stakes diplomacy that was about to happen inside its walls. The architecture was deliberately modest, clean lines and functional spaces, without the grotesque luxury that the Veilthari used to intimidate their guests. The air was standard atmospheric mix, no sedatives, no mood adjusters, no chemical manipulation, just air. I walked the corridors ahead of the summit with my team behind me. Mazur, Asante, Ruiz. The same four who had stood in that chamber 3 weeks ago. We had been offered the option to rotate out, to take leave, to let a fresh team handle the follow-up. All of us declined. This was our operation, and we would see it through. The first thing I noticed was the way other species reacted to our presence. It was subtle, but unmistakable. In the weeks before the incident, walking through a galactic station as a human meant navigating a constant undercurrent of mild condescension. Alien diplomats would look through you. Guards would position themselves as if you were not quite important enough to require attention. Service staff would address your delegation last. That was gone. Every alien we passed acknowledged us. Not with fear, though I could see the shadow of it in some of their eyes. With attention. The particular focused attention that living creatures give to something they have classified as significant. Diplomats nodded. Guards stepped aside without being asked. A pair of HFY traders in the commercial district stopped their conversation as we passed and watched us with their faceted eyes until we rounded the corner. In the delegate lounge, a HFY trade official stopped me. He was smaller than most of his kind, older, with the slightly dulled sheen on his exoskeleton that marked advanced age in his species. He stood in front of me and spoke in halting English that he had clearly been practicing. "My daughter," he said. "She watched the footage 17 times. She is no longer afraid of Veilthari ships." I did not know what to do with that. I wanted to tell him that I had not done what I did for his daughter, that I had not been thinking about the HFY, or the galactic power balance, or the oppressed species of the quadrant. I had been thinking about a hand hitting my face, and the taste of blood in my mouth, and the million-year-old certainty that when something strikes you, you strike back harder. But that was not what he needed to hear, and I had learned enough about the galaxy by now to know that the reasons behind an action matter less than the consequences it creates. So I nodded, and he nodded, and we stood there for a moment in the corridor of a neutral station, a human soldier and an alien trade official, connected by a 6-second clip of violence that had become the most important piece of media in galactic history, and then we went our separate ways. The Veilthari delegation arrived 2 hours before the summit was scheduled to begin. I watched them from my position near the main entrance, counting personnel, assessing weapons, mapping their formation out of habit. They brought 40 delegates and a security detail of 30, down from the 50 that Ket had demanded. Their new lead representative was Councillor Thanais Vel, a career politician who had spent the last 2 decades in the Veilthari Senate and was known for the particular brand of ruthless pragmatism that separates survivors from casualties in alien government. Vel was smaller than Ket, shorter and more finely built, with 2 of 4 horns broken at the tip, in a pattern that I later learned was a voluntary marking, adopted by Veilthari, who had publicly opposed the military hierarchy. She walked with a measured pace that spoke of someone who understood the weight of every step she took, and had calculated its effect in advance. She saw me at the entrance. She stopped, looked at the scar on my face, and held my gaze for 3 seconds without speaking. Then she continued into the summit chamber without a word. The message was received. She knew who I was. She knew what I had done, and she was here to work, not to posture. The summit chamber on Meridian Cross was circular, with a single round table at its center, and seating arranged in equal sections. No elevated platforms, no lower tables, no hierarchy built into the furniture. The broadcast drones were present again, but this time they belonged to the Galactic Press Consortium, not to any single delegation. The coverage would be neutral, and every species in the galaxy knew it. The first 2 hours of the summit were procedural: introductions, protocol agreements, agenda setting. Ortiz handled it with the fluid competence that I had come to expect from her, navigating the formalities with a warmth that never quite crossed into familiarity. Vel responded in kind, polished and precise, revealing nothing that was not carefully chosen. Then Vel did something that nobody in the room expected. She signaled her delegation, and 2 Velthari attendants carried a holographic projector to the center of the table. They activated it, and the image that materialized above the table was Commander Zorvail Ket, in full ceremonial uniform, rotating slowly in blue light. The room tensed. I felt my team shift behind me, hands moving toward weapons out of trained reflex. But Vel raised a hand and spoke. "This is not a memorial," she said. Her voice was clear and carried to every corner of the chamber, and every drone in the air. "This is a reckoning." She began to speak, and for the next 40 minutes, she dismantled the legacy of Commander Zorvail Ket in front of the assembled galaxy. She did it with documents, with military records, with intercepted communications, and sealed court proceedings that had been buried under layers of classification for years. She presented evidence of orbital bombardments against civilian populations on 3 conquered worlds. She detailed forced labor programs that had displaced millions of HFY workers. She revealed suppressed reports of summary executions within the Velthari officer corps, commanders and sub-commanders who had questioned Ket's methods and been silently removed. She showed footage that had never been broadcast, surveillance recordings from conquered worlds showing Velthari military units destroying agricultural infrastructure to force dependent populations into compliance, comm intercepts of Ket ordering the destruction of refugee convoys that had been granted safe passage by his own negotiators, medical records from HFY labor camps documenting conditions that would have been classified as war crimes under any standard the galaxy claimed to uphold. Each piece of evidence landed in the chamber like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread through the delegations, and I watched faces change, postures shift, expressions harden. The HFY delegates were motionless, their faceted eyes absorbing information that confirmed what they had carried as unproven knowledge for years, the kind of truth that everyone knows but nobody can prove, the kind that eats at a species like acid, because justice requires evidence, and evidence requires access, and access was controlled by the very people committing the crimes. The room was dead silent. Representatives from the 11 species that had spoken against Ket after the incident watched with the grim satisfaction of people who had been telling the truth for a decade and were finally being believed. Vel did not stop there. She turned the reckoning inward. She acknowledged that the Velthari Senate had known about Ket's methods and had chosen silence over accountability. She named specific senators who had blocked investigations, redirected oversight committees, and provided political cover for military operations that violated every standard the Dominion claimed to uphold. She did not name herself among them, but she did not need to. Her presence at the podium, leading this confession, was its own admission. When she finished, she deactivated the projector. Ket's image dissolved into particles of blue light and vanished. "The Velthari Dominion does not ask forgiveness," she said. "Forgiveness is a gift that only the injured can offer, and we have no right to expect it. We offer instead a full accounting of what was done, by whom, and under whose authority. We offer the unsealing of all classified records related to Commander Ket's operations. And we offer the formal condemnation of his assault on the human delegation, not as a diplomatic gesture, but as an acknowledgement that his behavior in this chamber was consistent with a pattern of violence that the Dominion failed to check." She paused. Then she looked directly at me. "The human sergeant who ended Commander Ket's life did in 5 seconds what our institutions failed to do in 20 years. We do not celebrate violence, but we acknowledge that in this instance, it achieved what our laws, our courts, and our political structures could not." The chamber erupted into murmured conversation. Delegates leaned toward each other, exchanging rapid commentary. Broadcast drones repositioned themselves to capture every reaction. I stood at my post and absorbed the words without letting them show on my face, because whatever I felt about them was irrelevant to the job I was here to do. After the initial shock subsided, Ortiz requested the floor. She spoke briefly, accepting the Velthari statement and proposing a framework for ongoing dialogue. Then she turned to me and said something that I had not expected. The Galactic Diplomatic Corps has requested that Sergeant Hale provide a formal account of the incident for the summit record. Sergeant, the floor is yours. I had not been told this was coming. I looked at Ortiz, and she held my gaze with the steady expression of someone who had made a decision and was not interested in discussing it. I understood. The galaxy had seen the footage. Now they needed to hear the words. I walked to the podium. The broadcast drones adjusted their positions. I could feel the attention of every being in the room settle onto me like a physical weight, and I stood under it without bending. My name is Dominic Hale, I said. Sergeant, United Nations Marine Corps, 3rd Expeditionary Detail. 3 weeks ago, I was assigned to provide security for Ambassador Ortiz at a neutrality summit hosted by Commander Zorvail Kett aboard the Velthari flagship Throne of Silken Law. I told the story. Not the political version, not the strategic version. The truth. I described the arrival, the changed seating, the hours of insults, the submission cloth. I described the moment Kett walked past the ambassador and chose to stand in front of me. I described the slap, the blood, the words he spoke for the cameras. And then I described the 5 seconds. I did not make a decision, I said. I want the record to reflect that clearly. What happened in those 5 seconds was not a choice. It was a response. On my world, if something hits you, it is trying to end you. There is no ceremonial violence on Earth. There is no symbolic aggression. A strike is a strike, and the only answer our biology accepts is immediate, total neutralization of the threat. I paused. The chamber was silent. I have read the commentary that followed the incident. I have seen myself called a hero by some species and a savage by others. I am neither. I am a soldier from a planet that spent 4 billion years trying to kill everything on it. And I responded to a physical threat the only way my species knows how. I would do it again. Not because I enjoy violence, not because I wanted Commander Kett dead, because accepting a blow from a tyrant on a live broadcast seen by 900 star systems would have told every aggressor in this galaxy that humans can be struck without consequence. I looked at the assembled delegates, Velthari, HFY, and the representatives of 30 other species who had traveled to this station to witness whatever was about to happen next. You can negotiate with us, I said. You can trade with us. You can argue with us. You can insult us, and we will probably insult you back, and then buy you a drink afterward, because that is how we are built. But you cannot strike us. That lesson was always going to cost someone. I am sorry that it cost your commander his life. I am not sorry that the lesson was learned. I stepped back from the podium. The silence held for 4 full seconds. Then the HFY lead delegate stood. Then 3 more delegates from other species. Then the entire HFY section. They did not applaud. Their culture did not have that tradition. They stood in silence, which in their civilization was the highest form of respect. An acknowledgement that words were insufficient and that the only adequate response was to be present, upright, and bearing witness. The weeks that followed the Reconciliation Summit reshaped the galactic order in ways that I was only partially aware of as they happened. I learned about them in fragments, through briefings and intercepted transmissions, and the quiet observations of people who understood the mechanisms of interstellar politics better than I ever would. Earth was granted a permanent seat on the Galactic Security Council. The vote was unanimous, the first unanimous Security Council vote in over 40 years. 3 species that had blocked Earth's application for a decade reversed their positions within 24 hours of the Reconciliation Summit. No one explained the change publicly. No one needed to. The footage explained it. The testimony explained it. The scar on my face explained it. The phrase, the Kett Doctrine, entered the galactic military lexicon. It was simple. Never initiate physical contact with a Deathworlder under any pretense. Not ceremonial. Not symbolic, not disciplinary, no contact. The doctrine spread through military academies, diplomatic training programs, and first contact protocols across the galaxy within a month. It was treated not as a suggestion, but as a survival guideline, filed alongside warnings about atmospheric toxins and gravitational hazards. I heard later that one species, the Methali, had incorporated it into their children's education as a cautionary principle. Do not touch the Deathworlders. They come from a place where touch means danger, and they respond accordingly. 17 species formally requested human military advisors for the first time. Not human soldiers, not human weapons, just advisors. Observers who could sit in their war rooms and offer the perspective of a species that had been fighting since the first cell divided on a planet that punished hesitation with extinction. The requests were polite, carefully worded, and unanimous in their underlying message. We want to understand how you think, because we have realized that not understanding is dangerous. The economic shifts were quieter, but equally significant. Human trade delegations reported that negotiation timelines shortened by an average of 40% in the months following the incident. Alien corporations that had previously stalled on joint ventures with human firms suddenly found the motivation to close deals. Nobody said the word "ket" in those boardrooms. Nobody needed to. The understanding was ambient, woven into the background of every interaction, like a frequency too low to hear, but too strong to ignore. 3 oppressed species in the outer systems began citing what they called the Ket incident in territorial disputes with larger powers. They did not invoke Earth directly. They did not need to. The implication was enough. The footage existed. The precedent existed. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, there were ships crewed by Deathworlders who had demonstrated in 6 seconds of broadcast footage that they did not tolerate bullies. The Galactic History Preservation Society contacted Earth Command and requested the monoblade I had used. They wanted it for their permanent collection, alongside the weapons and artifacts that marked the turning points of galactic civilization. I declined. The blade was still on my hip, cleaned and sharpened, and maintained the way I had maintained it every day since the day I was issued it. It was not a museum piece. It was a tool, and I was not finished using it. I traced the encrypted message. It took time. The encryption was layered, routed through dead relays and abandoned communication satellites in deep Veilthari space, designed to be untraceable by anyone without the specific decryption keys that Earth's intelligence division eventually cracked. The message had come from a group of junior Veilthari officers who called themselves the Velshan. The word translated roughly as the ashamed. They were career military personnel who had spent years documenting Ket's crimes through official channels that led nowhere, filing reports that were buried, submitting evidence that was classified and sealed. They had watched their commander brutalize conquered populations and purge dissenting officers, and they had done everything their system allowed them to do to stop it, and their system had failed them. There were 14 of them. 14 officers across 7 ships and 3 ground installations, connected by encrypted channels and shared disgust, doing the quiet, thankless work of collecting evidence that nobody wanted to see. 2 of them had been demoted for asking the wrong questions. 1 had been transferred to a deep space monitoring post so remote that her communication relay had a 40-minute delay. They had persisted anyway, because some obligations do not care about consequences. They did not want public credit. They did not want recognition or reward, or a place in the history that was being written around the incident. They wanted one thing. They wanted me to know that not every Veilthari was blind. That the rot was in the structure, not the species. That good people had tried and failed, and carried the weight of that failure like a wound they could not treat. I read their message 3 times. Then I wrote a response, 4 words, and sent it through the same encrypted channel they had used. I believe you. Thank you. It was not enough. 4 words could never be enough to answer years of silent resistance, and the shame of watching injustice and being unable to stop it. But it was what I had, and I sent it, and I hoped that somewhere in Veilthari space, a junior officer read those words and felt the weight on their shoulders ease, even slightly. The night before we departed Meridian Cross, I stood at a viewport on the observation deck and looked out at the starfield. The station rotated slowly, and the stars wheeled past in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the politics and violence and grand reckonings of the small creatures that traveled between them. I had been looking at stars through viewports for 5 years, and they never changed, and that consistency was comforting in a way that I could not fully explain. Everything else shifted. Alliances formed and dissolved. Species rose and fell. Commanders lived and died. The stars kept burning. I thought about the word that Vel had used, reckoning. It was the right word, not justice, because justice implies a system, a process, a deliberate weighing of evidence and punishment. What happened in that summit chamber was not justice. It was a reckoning, the natural, inevitable correction that occurs when pressure builds too long in a system that has no release valve. Ket was the pressure. I was the rupture. Neither of us chose our roles. The physics of the situation chose them for us. Ambassador Ortiz found me there. She stood beside me and looked out at the same stars, and for a while neither of us spoke. The historians are already writing about this, she said eventually. They are calling it the 5-second pivot. The moment Earth stopped being a guest in the galactic community and became a pillar. That is a lot of weight to put on 5 seconds, I said. 5 seconds and 20 years of a tyrant's unchecked power. You were the catalyst, not the cause. Ket built the pressure, you released it. I considered that. It was a kinder framing than I deserved, and I suspected she knew it. But diplomats are in the business of framing, and Ortiz was very good at her job. What happens now? I asked. Now we do the hard part. We sit in rooms and negotiate trade agreements and security protocols and cultural exchange programs. We build the relationships that make the next Ket impossible, not through fear, but through integration. Through being so deeply woven into the fabric of galactic civilization that removing us would unravel the whole thing. And if another Ket shows up before the weaving is done? Ortiz looked at me. Then she looked at the blade on my hip. Then I imagine the response time will be even shorter than 5 seconds, she said. I almost smiled. Almost. She left me at the viewport, and I stood there alone for a while longer. The stars turned. The station hummed. Somewhere out in the dark, 900 star systems were adjusting to a new reality, one in which the quiet species from the small blue Deathworld was no longer content to sit at the lower table and absorb insults with a polite smile. I touched the scar on my cheek. The ridge was smooth now, fully healed, a permanent feature that I would carry for the rest of my life. I thought about what it represented. Not the slap, not the blade, the line, the invisible boundary between what a human will tolerate and what a human will not. The line that Ket had crossed without understanding that it existed. The line that every species in the galaxy was now mapping with urgent precision. I turned from the viewport, adjusted the blade on my hip, and walked back to my post. My boots sounded steady on the station floor. My breathing was even. My hands were still. The galaxy was watching. Let them,